Go. We don't want you here anymore. Those were the exact words my mother-in-law said to me after 12 years of marriage, and she wasn't even the one who ended up destroying me that day. 12 years I gave that family, and it took her 12 seconds to make it clear none of it ever mattered. I stood in that foyer with my suitcase already packed, waiting for anybody in that house to look me in the eye, and instead I got that sentence, flat and cold, like she'd been saving it up for over a decade, just waiting for the right morning to finally say it out loud. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just nodded and turned toward the door, because I already knew nothing I said back to her was going to change a single thing in that house. What I didn't know, what none of them knew, is that the quietest person in that entire family, the one who'd never said 2 unnecessary words to me in 12 years, was about to hand me something at that gate that would flip every single thing they thought they'd won. Before I tell you what happened next, hit subscribe and turn your notifications on, because this story does not slow down from here, and if you leave before the end, you're going to miss the part everybody in the comments is going to be talking about. If a mother-in-law has ever made you feel like you didn't belong in your own marriage, stay right here. This one's for you. 12 years. That's what I gave the Beaumont family before it ended. 12 years of remembered birthdays, holidays hosted at my table, hospital visits when nobody else showed up, and not one single bit of it mattered the morning my husband decided he was finished with me. No children between us. No property with my name on the deed. Not one photograph on those walls that would miss my face. I stood in the foyer of that big house on Beecher Street in Cascade Heights with a suitcase I'd packed in 11 minutes, and I waited for somebody, anybody, to ask me to stay. Nobody did. That silence sat heavier on me than anything anybody could have shouted. I think about the first Sunday dinner sometimes, 12 years back, the very first time Deborah Beaumont looked at me across that long mahogany table and decided, right then and there, exactly what kind of woman I was going to be to her for the rest of however long this lasted. I had reached for the wrong serving spoon. There were 3 laid out beside the sweet potato casserole, and I picked up the one meant for the greens instead, and she didn't say a word about it out loud. She just watched me set it back down, corrected me with a small tight smile, and went right back to her conversation with Harold like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. I felt it settle over that table like a change in weather, and it never once lifted in 12 years, not for a single Sunday dinner after that. There were other dinners too, dozens of them, where Deborah found small ways to remind me I wasn't quite Beaumont material. She'd ask about my mother's cooking back in Macon with a tone that made it sound like a place people escaped rather than a place people came from. She'd compliment Renee's new dress in front of me, and then look at whatever I was wearing with a pause just long enough to mean something. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Deborah Beaumont built her whole reign on the strength of pauses and small smiles and comments that sounded like compliments until you turned them over in your head 3 hours later and realized they weren't compliments at all. 12 years of that wears a person down slow, the way water wears down stone, and I hadn't even noticed how thin I'd worn until I was standing in that foyer with a suitcase, finally hearing her say the quiet part loud. Deborah Beaumont, my mother-in-law, stood at the bottom of the staircase with her hands folded in front of her like she was posing for a church photograph titled Relief. She never liked me, not since that very first Sunday dinner, and now she stood there watching me pack my whole life into one suitcase with the calm satisfaction of somebody who'd finally gotten her house back the way she always wanted it. "God, we don't want you here anymore," she said, and then she didn't say anything else at all. She just watched. And that watching told me everything about how long she'd been waiting on this exact morning to arrive. Renee, my husband's younger sister, sat on the bottom steps scrolling her phone like my leaving was nothing more than background noise to her Tuesday afternoon. She glanced up once, gave me a small, satisfied little smile, and went right back to her screen. Renee had spent a decade making comments about how I didn't quite fit, talked too country, dressed too plain, came from the wrong side of Macon, and never let anybody forget it. That morning she didn't even need words. Her silence did the same job her comments used to do, and honestly, it landed harder. Marcus never came downstairs. I stood in that foyer for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, giving him every chance to look at me one final time before I walked out of a 12-year marriage. He stayed upstairs. I told myself it was because he couldn't face what he'd done to me. Later I'd learned the real reason had nothing to do with guilt at all. But standing there that morning, all I felt was a particular kind of cold, The kind that comes from being erased by a man who once promised to choose you every single day for the rest of his natural life. I didn't argue with any of them. I didn't cry, not there, not in front of Deborah Beaumont. I had promised myself, whatever happened, I was not going to give that woman the show she was clearly hoping for. So I walked toward the door with my chin level and my suitcase wheels clicking against the hardwood floor. Deborah had refinished twice in 12 years, and I reached for the handle myself because not one soul in that house moved to open it for me. That's when Odessa Grant stepped out from the kitchen hallway, wiping her hands on her apron the way she always did right before she said something that mattered. Odessa had cooked in that house for 26 years, longer than Deborah had even been married into the family. She'd watched 3 generations pass through that kitchen table, and in the 12 years I'd been a Beaumont, she was the only person under that roof who ever once asked how I was really doing and then actually waited around for the honest answer. She held out a brown paper grocery sack, the kind with handles gone soft from years of reuse, folded over twice at the top. "Take this on your way out," she said, loud enough for Deborah to hear from across the room. "Compost bin's already full anyway." Deborah didn't even look over. To her it was nothing: vegetable peels, coffee grounds, the unremarkable leftovers of a household that would keep running exactly the same without me in it come tomorrow morning. I took the bag without thinking twice about it, murmured a thank you, and walked out into the Atlanta heat. The porch light was still burning, even though it was almost noon. I walked down the brick path, past the boxwoods Deborah babied like they were her 4th child, and out through the wrought iron gate that Marcus's grandfather had put up himself 60 years earlier. Behind me, I heard the front door close. Not slammed, closed, slow and deliberate, like they were sealing something shut for good. I did not turn around. I had promised myself I wouldn't give them that either, and for once in that house, I kept a promise to myself instead of everybody else. I made it 4 blocks before the weight of that bag started bothering me. It wasn't heavy exactly, but it sat wrong in my hand, shifted strange with every step, nothing like the soft give of vegetable scraps or the clink of empty bottles. I stopped near the corner of Cascade and Beecher, under the shade of a pecan tree somebody's grandmother had probably planted 50 years before I was born, and I told myself I was being paranoid. That grief makes you suspicious of everything, that a bag is just a bag. My hands opened it anyway. There was no trash inside. At the bottom, wrapped twice in a plastic grocery sack and taped shut with packing tape, sat a small brass key and a folded index card. My hands started shaking before I even understood why. I unfolded the card first. In Odessa's careful handwriting, the same script I'd seen on grocery lists left on that kitchen counter for 26 years, it read, "Storage Unit 114, Ashford Self-Storage off Cascade Road." He kept it from her. She kept it from both of them. I kept it from everybody until somebody finally deserved to have it. "That's you, baby. Go today. Don't wait." I stood under that pecan tree reading those 2 sentences over and over until the words stopped being words and just became a feeling, a slow rising disbelief that the one person in that house I'd never fully understood had apparently been paying closer attention than anybody else combined. I did not know what he kept it from her meant. I didn't know who she was supposed to be. I only knew Odessa Grant did not do a single thing without purpose, and if she'd risked a 26-year job to hand me a key at that gate, then whatever sat behind that storage door mattered more than every last thing hanging on Deborah's walls. I called a rideshare because my hands shook too bad to trust myself behind a wheel. The drive down Cascade Road took 14 minutes, and I spent every single one of them staring at that small brass key like it might disappear if I looked away too long. Ashford Self-Storage sat behind a gas station off the road, rows of orange doors baking under the same hard Georgia sun that had followed me straight out of that house. I found Unit 114 near the back row, the paint faded almost white, a padlock hanging from the latch that matched the key in my palm exactly. My hand shook so hard it took 3 tries to get that key into the lock. When it finally turned, the metal door groaned up on its track, and dust caught the light pouring in behind me. Inside sat a single filing cabinet, a stack of banker's boxes, and an old roll-top desk I recognized right away. It had belonged to Marcus's grandmother, Odell Beaumont, who'd passed 6 years before I ever met the family. Nobody had mentioned this desk in 12 years. Nobody had mentioned this storage unit existed at all, not once, not even in passing. I opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet first, And that's when I finally understood why Odessa had risked everything she'd built over 26 years to make sure I got here before anybody else did. Inside sat folders, dozens of them, organized by year, each one labeled in handwriting I didn't recognize yet, but would come to know close and personal over the following hours. Odell Beaumont's own careful hand, formal and precise. The same woman whose portrait hung above Deborah's fireplace like a saint nobody in that family was ever allowed to question or discuss. The first folder held bank statements for an account I'd never once heard mentioned, opened 30 years earlier under the name Odell Marie Beaumont, kept separate from the family's joint holdings, separate from the funeral home business that had made 3 generations of Beaumonts comfortable in this city. The balance on the most recent statement, dated only 4 months before Odell's death, showed just under $2 million. I sat down hard on an overturned crate in that storage unit and read that number 3 separate times before it started to feel real in my hands. The second folder explained the why behind all of it. Inside sat letters, handwritten, dated across 2 full decades, every single one addressed to my future daughter-in-law, whoever the good Lord sends her to be. Odell Beaumont had died before Marcus and I ever laid eyes on each other. But somehow, impossibly, she had written to me anyway, years before I even existed inside this family story. She wrote about her own marriage into the Beaumont name, about a mother-in-law who had made her feel exactly the way Deborah had made me feel for 12 straight years, and about a fortune she had quietly built on her own terms so that whoever loved her grandson would never once have to walk out of a marriage carrying nothing at all, the way she herself had so nearly done. I sat on that crate reading those letters with dust in the air and traffic humming somewhere outside, and for the first time since walking out that gate, I let myself cry. Not because of the money, though Lord knows the money mattered plenty. I cried because a woman I never got the chance to meet had thought about me before I even existed, had built something for me in complete secret, had trusted the truth would eventually find its way into the right hands even if it took 30 years to get there. Odell Beaumont had understood something about her own family that it took me 12 hard years to learn the exact same way. The third folder was the one that changed the shape of everything that came after it. Inside sat a trust document, drafted by an attorney whose name I recognized from a firm downtown near Peachtree, establishing that the account would transfer automatically to Marcus's wife the moment his first marriage dissolved, provided that marriage ended without children and without the wife holding property in her own name. The exact conditions, word for word, describing my exact situation. Odell hadn't just left me money sitting in an account. She had built a trust specifically designed to trigger the moment a Beaumont wife walked out of that house with nothing, because she herself had once walked out with nothing, decades before, right before she reconciled with her husband and inherited everything she'd need to protect whichever woman came along after her. There was a complication, though, and the fourth folder laid it out in cold, careful legal language that took my breath clean away. Harold Beaumont, Marcus's father, the quiet man who spent his days tending roses on the back veranda and reading the paper without saying 2 words to anybody, had known about this trust for 6 full years. He had been named as its executor, and according to a stack of increasingly frustrated letters from the attorney, Harold had spent every one of those 6 years quietly stalling its activation, hoping his son's marriage would either produce a grandchild or simply never end, because the moment it did end, $2 million would leave the family and land squarely in my hands. I finally understood the man who had barely spoken a full sentence to me in 12 years. Harold Beaumont's silence hadn't been indifference the whole time. It had been calculation, a slow, deliberate strategy of waiting and hoping and delaying. Anything at all to avoid the day his own mother's trust finally forced his hand. He had known this exact morning was coming for years, and when it finally arrived, he still didn't find the nerve to tell me any of it himself. He let his wife orchestrate my humiliation right there at that gate while he sat inside that house, silent as ever, letting a housekeeper do what he himself lacked the backbone to do. I called the attorney's office listed on those trust documents before I even left that storage unit. A receptionist told me Mr. Ashford was in a meeting, and I told her I would wait outside his office door until he wasn't, because I had just found a $2 million trust with my name attached to it, sitting in a storage unit I didn't even know existed an hour earlier. She put me through inside 90 seconds flat. Robert Ashford had drafted that original trust himself 30 years back, when Odell Beaumont first walked into his office, young and freshly humiliated by her own mother-in-law, wanting to build something nobody could ever take away from whichever woman loved into this family next. He confirmed every single thing in those folders within minutes, verified who I was, and then told me something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor a second time. Harold had contacted his office only 3 days earlier, asking whether there was any legal path left to dissolve the trust before it ever activated. 3 days before he handed me that bag at the gate, Harold Beaumont had been trying to make sure I never found any of it at all. I asked Ashford the one question that mattered most. If Harold had spent 6 years trying to kill this trust and had just tried again 3 days before, how had I ended up holding that key in my hand less than 2 hours after walking out that door? His answer confirmed exactly what my gut already suspected. Odessa Grant had been the one to alert his office, calling quietly 2 years earlier after she overheard Harold discussing the trust with Deborah in that kitchen, thinking nobody else was listening close enough to catch it. Odessa had spent 2 full years watching, waiting, protecting a secret that was never hers to keep in the first place, simply because it was the right thing to do for somebody she cared about. I sat in Ashford's office an hour later with those folders spread out across his desk, and he walked me through what came next. Because I had discovered the trust and confirmed my identity inside the legal window Odell's document specified, the funds would transfer into an account under my name within 10 business days, entirely separate from any divorce proceedings, untouchable by Marcus, by Deborah, by anybody with the Beaumont last name attached to their signature. Odell had built her trust airtight 30 years earlier, anticipating exactly the kind of family who would try to interfere with it down the line. She had known her own son better than he ever knew himself. I asked Ashford one more thing before I left his office that afternoon. Did Harold know I already had the key? He told me that under the trust's terms, once activated, the executor was legally required to notify the family within 72 hours, which meant somewhere across town, in a house I used to call home, Harold Beaumont was about to sit down and have a conversation with his wife that he had been dreading for 6 straight years, and there was not one single thing either of them could do left to stop it from happening. I did not go back to that house. I had no reason to, and if I'm honest, no desire to watch Deborah's face when that news finally landed on her. Instead, I called my sister, Yolanda, who lived 30 minutes away in East Point, and she showed up at my hotel room inside the hour with a bottle of wine and every intention of staying the whole night through. We sat on the edge of that hotel bed for a long time before either of us said much of anything. Yolanda held the folder of statements in her lap, flipping through the pages slow, shaking her head every few minutes like the numbers needed to be seen twice to be believed. She kept asking me the same question in different ways. Are you sure this is real? Are you sure nobody's going to take it back? Are you sure Harold can't undo it? And every time I answered her, some new piece of the last 6 hours settled a little deeper into place for both of us. Somewhere around midnight, she poured us both a second glass of wine we didn't really need and told me something I hadn't let myself think all day. She said maybe Odell Beaumont hadn't just saved me financially. She said maybe she'd saved me from believing, for one more single day, that 12 years of my life had meant absolutely nothing to anybody in that family. I cried again that night, the good kind of crying, the kind that empties you out instead of filling you up with more weight. Yolanda stayed until nearly 3 in the morning, and before she left, she made me promise her one thing, that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let Deborah Beaumont's voice live rent-free in my head for one more year of my life. I told her I'd try. I didn't know yet how long trying was actually going to take. 3 days later, exactly like Ashford predicted, Harold called me. I almost let it go to voicemail. When I finally answered, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever once heard it. None of that veranda calm, none of the newspaper in Rose's distance he'd hidden behind for 12 solid years. He asked if we could talk face to face. I told him we were already talking just fine right there on the phone, and whatever he needed to say, he could say it right then, because I no longer owed his family the comfort of sitting across a table from any of them. He told me he was sorry. Not for the money, he clarified quick, like that distinction was supposed to matter to me at all. Sorry for the years of silence. Sorry for never once standing up to Deborah on my behalf in 12 years of Sunday dinners. Sorry for watching his own mother's wishes gather dust in a storage unit because he'd been too scared of his own wife to honor what his mother had built with her own two hands. He said Odell had tried telling him near the end that whichever woman married into this family next deserved better than what she herself had lived through, and he had nodded along and agreed, and then spent 6 years doing exactly nothing about any of it. I asked him why he waited until I was already gone to say a single word of this. His answer was the most honest thing that man had said to me in 12 years combined. He said watching me walk out that gate with absolutely nothing had finally shown him what his silence actually cost, in a way that 6 years of reading his own mother's letters never once managed to. It took losing me completely for him to understand what keeping me would have required of him. Courage he apparently did not have until it was already too late to spend it on anything but an apology nobody asked him for. I didn't forgive him, not that day, not over the phone. But I didn't hang up on him either. There's a difference between forgiveness and simply letting a man say what he needs to say so the both of you can move forward carrying a little less weight between you. I let him finish talking. I thanked him, strange as it sounds, for eventually telling the truth even if it came 6 years and one humiliating morning too late to matter the way it should have. Then I told him I needed to go, because I did, because Yolanda was waiting with dinner going cold, and a whole life needing rebuilt was not about to build itself, while I stayed on the phone with a man who'd had 12 years to be brave and chose silence every single time instead. Marcus texted me 4 days after that. Not called, texted, which told me plenty about how seriously he was taking any of this. He asked if the rumors about the trust were true. I didn't answer right away. When I finally did, I told him the truth wasn't his business anymore. Same way my leaving apparently hadn't been worth a single word from him when it actually mattered most. He didn't text again after that, and I found I didn't miss the sound of my phone buzzing his name nearly as much as I thought I might. Deborah never called at all. I heard through Yolanda, who heard it through a mutual friend still tangled up in the Cascade Heights social circle, that Deborah had taken to telling people I'd manipulated Odell's estate somehow, that I'd always been after that family's money. 12 years of scheming finally paying off just like she always suspected. I let her say it. People who actually knew me, who watched me work double shifts at Grady Memorial for over a decade, while Deborah redecorated her sunroom twice in that same stretch of time, knew exactly how ridiculous that story sounded coming out of her mouth. The truth doesn't need my defense when the people who matter already carry it in their own hearts. The money landed in my account 9 business days after Ashford first confirmed the trust, 1 full day ahead of schedule. I sat at Yolanda's kitchen table staring at that number on my banking app for a long while before it started feeling real to me. $2 million is a strange kind of freedom, not because of what it buys, though Lord knows it buys plenty, but because of everything it removes. It removed the fear that had been living in my chest for months, fear of starting over at 43 with nothing but a suitcase and a hospital paycheck. It removed 12 years of feeling like I had to earn my place at a table that never once considered me real family to begin with. I used some of it exactly how I think Odell Beaumont would have wanted. I paid off Yolanda's mortgage without telling her a word until the payment already cleared, just to watch her face when the notification hit her phone. I set aside a fund to finally finish the nursing degree I'd put on hold twice during my marriage because Marcus always needed something more urgent than my own ambitions ever seemed to matter. And I bought myself a small house out in College Park, nothing fancy, just 4 rooms and a porch and a yard big enough for the garden I was never once allowed to plant in Deborah's meticulously curated landscape. Going back to school at 43 wasn't easy, and I won't pretend it was. There were nights during that program when I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by anatomy flashcards, exhausted from a full shift on my feet, wondering if I'd made a mistake starting over this late. But somewhere in the middle of that first semester, I started noticing something had shifted in me that I couldn't fully name at first. I wasn't studying to prove anything to Deborah anymore. I wasn't building a life around what the Beaumont name expected of me. Every flashcard, every exam, every late night belonged entirely to me. And there was a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in 12 years in simply doing something just because it was mine to do. I invited Odessa to see the house the week I moved in. She came on her day off, wearing a church dress instead of her apron for the first time I could ever remember seeing her in anything else. She walked through every room slow, nodding her head like she was inspecting her own handiwork. In a way, she was. Without her, that trust would still be sitting in a storage unit off Cascade Road right now. Harold would still be finding new ways to stall it. And I would have driven away from that gate believing I'd left 12 years of marriage with absolutely nothing to show for any of it. I asked her, sitting out on my new porch with sweet tea, sweating in the Georgia heat, why she'd risked everything for me. 26 years of employment, her whole standing with a powerful family, all of it on the line for a daughter-in-law she'd known just over a decade. She told me it wasn't really about me at all, not entirely. It was about a promise she'd made to Odell Beaumont herself, years before she passed, when the older woman pulled her aside in that very kitchen and asked her to watch, quiet and patient, for the day somebody finally deserved to know the whole truth. Odessa had been waiting 20 years for that day to come. She told me she'd watched 2 other women marry into that family and leave before I ever arrived, both times wondering if this was the moment Odell had been preparing for all along, both times deciding it wasn't quite right. The circumstances didn't line up close enough. When I walked out that gate with nothing, no children, no property, exactly the conditions written into Odell's trust, Odessa said something finally settled inside her chest that had been unsettled for 2 whole decades. She said it felt like laying down something heavy she'd been carrying since long before I ever set foot in Atlanta. There's a particular memory that comes back to me more than any other from those 12 years, and it wasn't even the worst thing Deborah ever did to me. It was small. It was my 5th wedding anniversary, and Marcus had forgotten it entirely, caught up in some deal at work, and I'd spent that evening alone in our bedroom while the rest of the family ate dinner downstairs without me, nobody bothering to knock and ask why I hadn't come down. Odessa was the only one who climbed those stairs that night, carrying a small plate of food up on a tray, setting it on the dresser without a word, patting my shoulder once before she left the room again. She never mentioned it again after that night, not once in the 7 remaining years I lived in that house. But I never forgot it either, and sitting in that storage unit reading her handwriting on that index card, I finally understood that small kindness hadn't been an accident. It had been who she was the entire time, quietly choosing me long before I ever had proof that anybody in that house did. I think about Odell Beaumont often now, a woman I never once met who somehow understood my exact situation 30 years before I ever lived through it. I think about how many women walk out of houses just like that one every single day, believing they're leaving with absolutely nothing, when the real truth is sometimes nobody in that room has found the courage yet to hand them what already belonged to them all along. I think about Harold, still living in that house with Deborah, still tending his roses, still finding new ways to dodge the conversations that actually matter most in a person's life. I finished my nursing degree 14 months after moving into that house in College Park. Yolanda sat in the front row at graduation, and so did Odessa, who had retired from the Beaumont household 6 months earlier, saying she'd finally done what she came there to do and didn't feel the need to stick around for whatever came after. I hugged her longer than I hugged anybody else that entire day, because she was the only person sitting in that audience who had actually seen me at my absolute lowest point and decided right then I was worth every bit of the risk she took. Marcus remarried 18 months after our divorce finalized, a woman half his age Yolanda described, a little unkindly if I'm honest, as exactly the kind of daughter-in-law Deborah had always dreamed of, quiet, agreeable, from a family with the right kind of name attached to it. I felt nothing when I heard that news, which surprised me more than the news itself ever could have. Somewhere in those 18 months, I had stopped measuring my whole worth against whatever Marcus decided to do with his life, and that felt like its own kind of inheritance, one Odell Beaumont never could have written into any trust document no matter how hard she tried. I still keep one of Odell's letters on my nightstand, the one she wrote 14 years before I ever met her son, addressed simply to whoever loves him next and finds herself standing at that gate someday. She couldn't have known my name. She couldn't have known the exact year or the exact humiliation that would finally trigger her trust into motion. But she knew the pattern because she'd lived it herself decades before, and she trusted that someday some woman standing exactly where I once stood would need proof she hadn't imagined the whole marriage, that something real and lasting had existed underneath all that cruelty, even if it took a stranger's foresight 30 years later to finally prove it true. Some nights I still think about that brown paper bag, the weight of it wrong in my hand, the 4 words Odessa said at that gate that changed the entire direction of my life. This ain't really trash. I think about how close I came to walking those 4 blocks without ever once opening it, trusting the label instead of checking what was actually sitting inside. The same exact mistake I made with my marriage for 12 straight years running. I don't make that mistake anymore. I check everything twice now, because I learned the hardest way a woman can learn it, that the people who love you quiet rarely announce it out loud, and the people who claim to love you loud rarely mean it the way they should. And some nights I think about Deborah's voice, still, even now. God, we don't want you here anymore. The sentence that was supposed to be the end of my story instead of the beginning of it. I've come to understand that sentence differently than she meant it. She thought she was closing a door on me. What she didn't know, what she still doesn't know most days, is that somebody far wiser than her had already opened another one, years before Deborah ever got the chance to speak. If you made it all the way here with me tonight, thank you, truly, for staying with Camille's story to the very end. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength or somebody else's, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with a woman who needs to hear that walking away with nothing sometimes means walking straight into everything you were always owed. We'll see you in the next story.